studying the early settlers and the West, how the West was won and all that, that's kind of like you wouldn't know anything about America because we don't understand the history if you're just doing the New Testament and the Old Testament, without the Old Testament. Now, today we're going to really go into, does it work now? Ah, you're the best. Sorry to bother you. All right. Today we're going to go in more. We're going to go into the Old Testament for about 15 chapters. But before we do that, one of the things I need to remind everybody of is that God never changes. God never changes. When you're dealing with the Old Testament, you're dealing with 2,000 years of history. And there's a lot of people that lived in those 2,000 years. The New Testament only deals with about 30 years. So you're only seeing, really you're focusing on Jesus, but even Jesus is only about 50 days worth of history. And if you're dealing with Paul, that's about 30 years, but just pretty much Paul. You see a little bit of how God works. The best way to find out really how God works really well is looking on beyond the New Testament. But the thing is, in the Old Testament, it is history. We can understand how everything works. We can see what's happening in people's lives. We can relate those lives to ourselves. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to be talking about a bunch of people. We're going to literally go through 15 different chapters if we make it that far. The Old Testament's history, we can see how people work, God works in ordinary lives. So if you want to understand how God works in people's lives, you read the Old Testament. Because you see God's heart and His love and how He does things. And you can say, oh, I can trust you. Because we learn to trust God, first of all, by reading the Bible. We see what He does. The things he does with people. The second way we learn to trust God is how He interacts with us. But we gain their initial trust by what the Bible says. All right, so let's go on. Jacob, wow. Jacob was not the guy most of us would have chosen to carry Abraham's lineage. Jacob was an interesting guy. Okay, remember we didn't talk much about Isaac because Isaac, not much happened there. But Jacob did a lot of things, and he did a lot of really bad things. Okay, Jacob was not the nicest guy in the world. He was deceitful and he was cunning. Okay, now, what are some of the things that Jacob did? Well, if you ever read Genesis, first thing you've got to remember that Jacob took Esau's birthright. Remember what happened? Esau and Jacob. Esau comes in from hunting, really hungry, and Jacob's like, hey, I'll take your birthright, I'll give you some food, but I'm not going to give you any food until you give me your birthright. Now, first and foremost, Esau, I'm sorry to say, and I'm going to refer to this guy as this, was an idiot. He was stupid. Because what the birthright meant is that in the Old Testament, whenever they divvied up all the stuff in the end, so okay, you get the estate going, and the estate, it's not half and half. Okay? It's double, everybody else gets a portion. So the firstborn son gets a double portion. So in a sense, because there's only two sons, Jacob would have divided it into thirds, in which the firstborn son would have got 2/3, and the last one got 1/3. So by taking his birthright, Jacob just literally took the 2/3, which he should have never got. But he did. But Esau was stupid and said, oh, yeah, I'll give it to you. Not a good guy. Not a smart thing to do. But Jacob shouldn't have done it in the first place. He didn't even need to. We're going to find out that he didn't even need to do this because God was going to bless him anyway. But that's what it was. The second thing Jacob did with Esau was that he took his blessing. Now, the blessing was not, it's interesting about a blessing. The blessing is basically, the father blessing the children prior to them moving on. But the father always blessed the firstborn first. So they got the better blessing. So remember what Jacob did? His mother got involved. He dressed himself up and made himself kind of smell like Isaac. Isaac was really hairy, so he put some fur on his arm to get him hairy. He was, yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Right, but Jacob was around 40 years old. Oh, absolutely. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you. And it's going to be the same with Joseph. Yep. And that's true. Now, don't get me wrong. We're going to see, and I agree with you, you're 100% right. Don't get me wrong. Because the verse we just went over, that God, okay, we didn't go over that verse yet. We're going to go over that verse next. But we're going to look at that God works everything out for the good. And so, but regardless, Jacob went along with it, and he deceived his father into giving him the birthright. Now, one of the things, the interesting thing is the birthright was never really a prophecy. It was never meant to be a prophecy. This is what's going to happen to you. And that's not what they did. It was just the blessing of the father. And that's what they did back then. So I don't think it was this thing, got this really special thing. But sadly, you're right. Jacob did go along with it. Mom was involved. Absolutely. Mom was involved. And just like we're going to see what Joseph did. But the key is that Jacob ends up getting a lot of stuff. But what about this first? Everybody's ever read Malachi? Malachi is a great book because Malachi is really, it's kind of like the New Testament found in the Old Testament. Because there's a lot of good stuff in Malachi. It was written after the diaspora, after the dispersion. They came back, 100 years after they came back. This is written in the time of Nehemiah. But the key is that when Malachi said, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. You ever heard that verse before? Oh, yes, that's a big one. You're going to have to read Malachi. It's literally the last book of the Old Testament. And it was the last book written in the Old Testament. It was written after Nehemiah. So it's the last one. But Jacob I loved you, but you ask, how have you loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother? Declare, yet I have loved Jacob, but Esau I have hated, and have turned his hill country into wasteland. Whoa, wait a minute. Did God just hate Esau? That doesn't sound like a loving God. So, absolutely. Oh, yeah, he was. He did very bad. He did bad stuff. Yeah. And rabbis actually stated a lot of that. Rabbis even today have stood back at Esau, and they've never really liked Esau. But the interesting thing is, let me just, before I answer more questions, let's go to the next verse, because there kind of gives us a clue that this was not the case early on, because let's read the next verse in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy was right before they went into the land, right before they even went into Edom. They had to march past Edom, march past Moab, all that to get in the land, right before they did this. But we'll see what God says. You are about to pass the land of your relatives, descendants of Esau, which is Edom. That's Edom. They will be very afraid of you, but be careful. Do not provoke him. I will not give you any of their land, nor will I not even though you put your foot on. I have given to Esau the hill country and his own. You are to pay for them everything you need. So God was for Esau. What happened? This is the thing about the Old Testament. This is where the Old Testament gets tough. Because just And I know this is tough but I'm going to have to explain it to you guys, because what happens next after this verse is what starts the whole problem. It's not that Esau was so bad himself, but the Edomite people did some very bad things to Israel. And we're going to find that farther along in the Old Testament. And that's why it's interesting, because when you read through the Psalms, there is a psalm dedicated to Edom and how bad Edom was. Edom, when they were marching through, literally, this was written before they marched past Edom. When they tried to march into Edom and said, hey, can we take this? We'll pay for everything. We'll do everything just like God told them to do. What do you think Edom did to them? They said, nope, you're not touching a foot in our country. We will not go around our... So they had to go around to somewhere else. So first thing Edom did was bad. We also know that when the Assyrians attacked Israel in 720, Edom clinged onto the Assyrians, took the Assyrian side against Israel. We're going to find in the prophets that Edom is spoken against because of that. Edom actually aided the Assyrians in helping to take Israel away. Very bad. We're also going to find that in Malachi, what's interesting is right before Malachi, about 100 years, when they were going to build the temple. Remember when they're going to build the temple? If you guys went through my Old Testament series, they're going to build the second temple, but they had a bunch of people attacking them. Guess who one of the people that were attacking them were? Edom. So in Amos, there was a prophecy that said, you're going down. God had a reason for it. He had a reason, because they attacked him. We're also going to find that Moab's going to go down, because we're going to find in a couple weeks, we're going to go through what Moab did to Israel, which was really, really bad. Boy, was it bad. So but we find in the Old Testament, and I appreciate what you guys are saying, everything you're saying, because you're right, God is a loving God, but there's a reason. Remember that paper I gave you about last week about that God is not a wrathful God? There is a reason for everything. So when we see this, we're dealing with Esau. I have to look and say, was Esau that bad? He wasn't good. It had nothing to do with him. It had to do with his descendants. And we find out that in the Psalms, I think it's Psalm 86, that Edom was very bad to them. We also find in Amos that God was actually pronouncing against them. I believe there's also one in Ezekiel that's pronouncing against Edom, because Edom did some really bad things to the Israelites. So God was justified to not like them. Okay. Any questions? I'm sorry, and I don't mean to cut anybody off. Is there any questions I can answer after that? When you get the full... Absolutely. Exactly.
And he knows the whole story. When he does punish, it's not like he's enjoying it.
Right.
It's not. I'm sure he's saddened by what he has to do.
Oh, yeah.
And what he has to do to, the people that he has to destroy.
Absolutely.
He didn't find any joy or anything like that. Like we do as humans. We tend to think like we put God as we think for ourselves.
Right.
He's totally different.
Completely different. You are absolutely right. So if you haven't read that paper from last week, which God is not a wrathful God, please do. Because I wrote it specifically to help people understand that when God attacks, he has a reason. So he has a reason to dislike Edom. Because they did some very bad things. And to be honest, they actually got pretty much wiped out. Because Babylon actually wiped out Edom in the end. We know that afterwards, that Edom got wiped out. So, is there any other questions, sir? Abimelech? Oh, well, you know, Abimelech, when Sarah died and Abraham wouldn't pay silver. So Abimelech, the guy, but that problem with that was, and we're going to see the same thing going on here in a little bit, that when Abraham was going to bury Sarah, if he would have taken the land Abimelech was offering for free, Abimelech would have had, we're going to see this here in a little while, Abimelech would have had an in into Abraham's life. So, it's a tit for tat. This is a quid pro quo, take. So Abraham's like, no, we're not doing that. I'm paying full price for this, so I own it, and it's just mine, and you're not going to be involved afterwards. There's a big issue with that in the Old Testament. That's another key. See what I mean by understanding the Old Testament? It's so hard because there's so many of these little issues we have to deal with. And you're right, Abimelech, that was a big problem, but Abraham knew not to do this. Again, we're going to see this. Give me just a minute. We're going to get into that in just a minute. All right. So what happened is because Jacob did that to Esau said, I'm going to kill the guy. I'd be a little mad too if I was Esau because, Jacob was pretty deceitful. But you know what? What's interesting is that God, in Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work for the good. Now, this is an interesting thing in our lives. We need to remember God is for us. God is not against us. Anything God does, He does it, like you just said, for the good. It's always for our benefit whether we do. So what happened was Jacob had to flee. This whole thing forced him to flee. And let me tell you what happened. God used it for His own purposes. So here's a good point, a good character point of our own to say, has there been anything in your life you did really bad? It may be bad, but trust me, God can use it for the good. And you may find out afterwards that was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. Changed my whole life. Because God does that for you. God loves you. God is on your side. God does great things for you. So just remember, regardless of how bad anything looks, God can turn it around. That's what He did here. Because what happened is God used Jacob's debacle to get him into the promised land. He ran up to basically around Jerusalem area, which is where God was going to give him in the end. And what's interesting about this whole thing was that God reminded Jacob during this time, remember he saw a stairway coming down from heaven, and God said, I am with you and I'm going to give you this land. But if you think about it, Jacob didn't have to do any of that stuff to get his birthright and everything else. God was already going to do it for him. Because God just reaffirmed it. It was already going to happen. Jacob didn't have to try to deceive everything to try to make it happen. God said, you are the one. From the very beginning. You're the one. And so all the stuff that Jacob did, although it was deceitful, he really ultimately didn't have to because God was going to bless him. And we're going to see from this point on that everything happens to Jacob is going to be a blessing from now on. Everything that happens to is going to be a blessing. Now, I'm not saying we're not doing what the charismatics. Oh, every brother, God will bless you if you give money. They're going to. No. It's not that. God favors you. He loves you. But everything He's going to do for you is going to be for the good and for His purposes. Just trust in Him. So what happens is, remember Haran? We talked about Haran last week. Jacob goes back up there again. Remember, it's 500 miles northeast in Turkey. He went up there because they needed to marry within the family. Esau also messed up because Esau married a bunch of local girls, which made Isaac's mom, Rebekah, very, very angry. She was not happy with Esau at all because he married local girls. And now maybe that can help you understand why his mom did that, because you were totally right. His mom actually did a lot of that. But it's all because he married local girls, and no, you're supposed to marry within the family. And that's what Jacob did, is went up to Haran. He met up with a family member of Abraham named Laban. And what ended up happening is Laban said, I want Leah, not Rachel. Rachel, not Leah. Rachel was the younger, Leah was the older. Okay? Leah had weak eyes, Rachel was beautiful. Now, weak eyes really does not mean she was ugly and she couldn't see. What it means is she had pretty eyes, but she wasn't gorgeous. It's like, oh, you're cute, pretty eyes. Well, you're gorgeous. That's kind of the idea. Leah was pretty eyes, but Rachel, she was hot, right? And so the thing is, that's why Jacob wanted Rachel. And does everybody remember what Laban did after 7 years? He worked 7 years for her. What did Laban do? He switched them. He got him drunk, and he got in there. And next morning you're waking up, and you're like, oh, my wedding night, I got Rachel. And then you're like, who are you? Dude, what's up with this? Laban. Laban was a very bad man. But here's the thing. Two things are happening here. And Laban was deceitful. He should have told him this in the beginning. First of all, he had to work for the bride price. Now, this is a key in the Old Testament. You're going to find that when you take a bride, you have to pay the family money. And it's not that you're buying her from him. What happens is, if something happens to the bride or the husband and the wife has to go back to the family, now she's taken care of. Exactly. The bride price is to provide for the wife, because the wife cannot really work very much. She is not going to be a big earner. And what happens is, after that, now she's taken care of. But so what happened is, Jacob worked 7 years for the bride price. That's a long time for a bride price. You should only have to work a year for it. It's usually wages of a year. But he worked 7. So that was the bride price. Yes, ma'am? Sure. Absolutely. No, you're right. It's right. Absolutely. Yep. Oh, and trust me, he will find out. And that's exactly right. Laban did really bad. But actually what happened is it even got worse, because then Jacob's like, if you want this hot one, you got Rachel, the good-looking one, you want her? 7 more years, buddy. So he had to work 14 years. 14. Now, the problem we're going to find out, though, is Laban was, I'm going to call him stupid. He didn't keep the money. He spent the money. And we're going to see that it's going to cause a big uproar here in a minute. Okay? So, this is like Hollywood, right? You got a little movie going on here. We got, whoa, Laban, what did you do? Oh. Yeah, that's right. The days of our lives. Ancient Israel edition. You know? All right, so they Laban the bride price. Now, so what ended up happening after that, God started blessing Jacob. And he started getting too much sheep. And so Laban says, hey, wait a minute, we need to separate these guys because you're making too much money off me. And Jacob's like, look, I'll take the bad sheep. The speckled and the spotted sheep were not the good sheep. They were thought of as bad sheep. Okay? Remember, whenever in Israel, whenever you had to kill a lamb for sacrifice, they had to be perfect. They couldn't be like that. Okay? Because the best sheep, God said, I want the best sheep. So Jacob says, all right, sure, I'll just take those guys then. That's fine. And God blessed him and blessed him. Now, he tried to use divination and all this other stuff. It didn't work. God still blessed him. We're not going to get into all the things that Jacob did with the sticks and all the other stuff. We're not getting into that. But the key is, Jacob did that, and God blessed him. And Laban kept spending money. So what happened is that in the end, he got mad at Jacob and threatened Jacob. Laban did. Okay, now this is the continuing story, the continuing saga of the days of our lives. And the thing is, so what happened? So Laban threatened Jacob, and Jacob's like, fine, we're out of here. We're gone. And they had no money left. Or basically, Laban didn't have the money. So Laban was very angry. And so he came after them. But here's the key. And this is an interesting thing. Now, again, this is one of those blink and miss it moments in the Bible. They stole Laban's idols. They put them underneath the camel's seat because they were small. And what did the ladies say they had going on? Their menstrual cycle. Now, let me tell you about the menstrual cycle then. The menstrual cycle in the Old Testament, the problem with the menstrual cycle was you got demons. That's what they thought. The men thought women had demons. So if you're on your menstrual cycle, you don't mess with the women on a menstrual cycle. Seriously. And this is what happened here. She had the things underneath there, and he's like, I'm on my menstrual cycle. And Laban's like, gets kind of upset about it. Okay, then. Okay, no demons for me. He goes away. So the thing is, idols, again, this is a polytheism problem. Remember I said if you got to understand polytheism to understand the Old Testament. I've been saying that every single week. Because the key is, they believed that the idols held the God. No idol, no God. There's been Egyptians, when I believe it was Babylon went and attacked Egypt, they captured their main idols. Egypt gave up after that, seriously. They gave up. Why? No God to help us. Idols are gone, God's gone. That's why it was such a big deal what she did with him. No idol, no God. Nobody's going to help me now. Now again, it seems stupid to us because our Western minds were like, well, this is crazy, and there's no idol, there's no God there, there's no whatever. But to them, they believed it. And so when she stole his idols, she took everything from him. So basically, they got back at Laban big time. They got back at Laban big time by taking his idols. Whoa. So, because basically there's no God to bless Laban now. Laban's like, he's done for. So if you think about it, you read that and you go, I don't understand. What's up with that? Well, who cares? No, it was a huge thing. They really got back at him at that. So, all right. So then we go back. Finally, after all that time, Jacob decides to go back home. Jacob's about 97 years old right now. Okay? He decides to go back home. Now, and on his way back to home, this is an interesting point. He wrestles with God. God comes down, wrestles with him. Now, I'm not even going to try to understand all of that. Because, I read through about 10 different commentaries to try, what the heck? But the idea was that Jacob was, basically was on a spiritual journey. He wanted to know God, and he fought with God. Now, whether it was a physical thing, whether it was a spiritual thing, whatever it was, the key was he was wrestling with God. And if you understand the way Jacob was, you can understand, Jacob probably would wrestle with God. But you know what? In the end, so here's the key. The story includes a dietary restriction curve. So what God did a couple things in this point. Number one, he changed his name. What is now Jacob going to be called? Israel. Yeah, this is the big guy. Now, from now on, the people are no longer ever referred to as Jacob again. The whole people are going to be called what? Israel. So regardless of whatever happened here, God did a major thing. Changed the name. From now on, we still call them Israelites because of this. This is what did it. We now call them that because of what God did. So this was a pretty major thing. Ooh. So it also, because what happened, dietary restrictions, basically, because of that, the Israelites were never able to eat the hindquarters of animals. Because what did Jacob get damaged? Right, in the back of his leg. So even today, Israelites still don't eat that stuff because of that. Now, it does have nothing to do with us now. So we, whatever. Everybody likes a good heel, right? I don't know. But, we still have. But the key is that this was a major event. It wasn't some small little thing that came out of nothing and said, oh yeah, God just wrestled. No. Not only because it changed, that even 4,000 years later, we're still calling it because of this event. That's how important some of these things are in the Bible. So, Jacob also received a limp from this, that he always will. There's always going to be a reminder to Jacob. But the good news is, doesn't matter what ended up happening in the end. What really mattered was that God used it for the good, and God changes everything because of it. Any questions about that? Sir?
Don't you think that Israel, Esau felt sorry for Israel because he went up to him? He might have been really ready to kill him, but he had to feel sorry for his little brother had a physical problem.
Well, we don't know that because we haven't met Esau yet. It happened afterwards. So you're right. They haven't met Esau yet because they're actually on their way. He's going to Esau, yes. That's right, exactly.
That's why I'm saying Esau probably felt sorry.
I'm sure there probably was. Well, and it's interesting you say that because that's kind of the next thing. When they unite, Esau actually has no problem with Jacob now. So again, we go back to the very beginning, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. Esau doesn't really react like a hated guy. Well, Jacob, yeah, he did, but so Jacob gathered all the people, separated the women and children, thought they're going to have a battle, but Esau just came up to him and does that. Hugs him. So in a sense, he wasn't acting like a hated person. So again, Esau was not a great guy. He was kind of dumb. He wasn't the smartest guy in the world. And again, he acted very nicely to Jacob. And Jacob did everything bad to him. He could have killed Jacob. And Jacob thought that was what was going to happen. But Esau was nice. So in the end, again, it's not the fact that what Esau did, it was everything that happened once they got into the land. So it was later on where we get the Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Does that make sense? Do you have any other questions? That was a good thought, though. It's a good thought, exactly right, because that's exactly what happened. Esau actually acted nobly. He acted nice. All right, Jacob had 12 sons. Here they are. Now, he's going to end up having 13 in the end, but we're not going to get to that till next week. But 12 sons. And it's a good thing to remember this, because why is it good to remember these guys' name? All right, we'll get to that in a minute. But why is it good to know the names of these guys? I'm sorry. They're the tribes of Israel. Because what we're going to find out, that all the tribes of Israel are going to be named because of this. You will get to your thing just in just a minute. We're getting to Joseph. But yes, they're the tribes of Israel. Very good. So again, here's another good thing to remember. So far, what you guys have learned today is you've learned a bunch of stuff to help you to understand the Old Testament about polytheism, about bride price, about menstrual cycles and all these other things. Because if you take those little hints with you and you read the rest of the Old Testament, it will start making sense. That's why we go through all this, because when next time you go through and read something in the Old Testament, you see something about menstrual cycle, you're going, ooh, they must have thought she had demons. And that's really what they thought. And that's one of the reasons why in I think it's Leviticus and Exodus that they actually talked about women needing to separate themselves and stuff like that during the menstrual cycle. All right, Dinah and the Shechemites. Ooh, this is bad. Now again, this is the next episode in the days of our lives. I love that. That's really awesome. So the key is that Dinah was one of the daughters of Jacob. You rarely hear about any daughters of Jacob, but we know there was a few of them. She went out for a walk one day, went out somewhere one day, and this guy named Shechem raped her. And he thought she was hot and said, woo, I want that woman, and he raped her. Now, so let's do this. My son Jacob has this heart set on a daughter. Please give her to me as his wife. Intermarry with us. Give us your daughters and take our daughters for yourselves. You can settle among us and the land is open to you. So what happens is Shechem's dad says, hey, wait a minute, because Jacob was pretty mad about this. Don't blame him. He's had his daughter raped. Okay? But the problem was, Hamor said, oh, this is a great thing. And we'll see in a minute that Hamor had ulterior motives here. But Jacob also had ulterior motives. One of the things that Hamor said later on was, won't their livestock, their property, and their animals become ours? He was greedy. He wanted their stuff. He's like, hey, let's intermarry. Then we get their stuff. So let us agree to their terms, and they will settle among us. Does anybody know what the terms were? It was a big one. It was a big one. All right. Jacob's son told the Shechemites they would agree to the marriage if all the men became circumcised. Now, think about it. If you're a guy, you just cringe to yourself going, it ain't good. I don't know. But in the end, this is the reason why. He said, oh, we're going to get their stuff. But now, one thing we got to understand that this is a policy. This is something in the Middle East that we still see in Saudi Arabia today. Women get raped, and it's their fault because they weren't with male companions. Even today, they actually have religious police out making sure that women are not, because the guys can't control themselves. Well, in Western civilization, guys, you got to learn to control yourself. You can't just, when you see a good-looking woman, you can't just go and just jump her, whatever you want to do to her. That's terrible. But back then, that's what happens. It was sad, but it's true. That women had to be that's why women, even today in the Middle East, women always have to go with a male companion or like a brother or something. Because of this right here, it still happens. Sad to say, but true. So what did Jacob's sons do? All right. 3 days later, while all of them were in pain, 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took the swords and attacked the unsuspecting sinning, killed everybody. All the males, I should say. I don't think that was a great idea, but that's what they did. They seized their flocks, donkeys, and everything, and they carried all their wealth and their women and children, taking plunder. They took them all. I'm not going to say that's a good thing, but that's what they did. Jacob was not happy because of this. But again, we're going to see that regardless of the bad things these guys did, God still works it for the good. Let's see why. Again, we remember, God works all things out for the good. Even though they did this terrible thing, Jacob was worried because of this that the surrounding towns would come after him. I don't blame him. I wouldn't be happy either. You guys just went and killed all these guys and took all their families, took all this stuff. Jacob was worried. But this is what God did. Then they sent out, and the terror of God fell on the towns around them, and no one pursued them. God still protected him. God still took care of him, as bad as it was. Granted, we don't know what other because I guarantee that whenever you do bad things, something's not good, you never know what's going to happen later on. That's why God always says, choose what's right. Do what's right, because I know for a fact, in the past, when I did bad things, it never comes out great. God still protected them, but we don't know what kind of problems they may have to find later on. All right. So what Jacob does is says, okay, God protected us. Now, God took Jacob's family up to the promised land again. They went back up there again. God keeps bringing them back. Why? Can someone tell me, why does God keep bringing them back over and over again?
Where he wants them. It's their promised land, which is supposed to be their inheritance.
That's exactly right. God wants to remind them over and over and over. God wants to, this is another great thing about God. If God wants you to do something, He will make it clear to you. He will make it clear, even though it may take time. God made it very clear that that land is not going to be their land at that point, but they're going to own that land in time. Isn't it wonderful how God works? Isn't it wonderful what God does? Because again, we can use this whole information for our lives and say, wow, God is going to take care of us. Even though He may not be the greatest, we may do bad things, God can still use it for the good. So, then God go up to Bethel and there build an altar. So basically, go up to the promised land. So Jacob had said to his household, get rid of foreign gods. Meaning, now remember, we've got to remember this was a polytheistic society. His family members had foreign gods. But one thing God did for that was said, time to get rid of all this old stuff. Come to me and be mine. God was bringing everybody and say, let's get rid of that junk in your lives. Okay? Now, God also does that for us. He takes us through places and says, well, it's time to get rid of the junk in your lives that keep me away from you. He does those things. So basically, we're just about done. Then come, let it to build, and I'll build an altar. Who answered me and this is what Jacob said. God, who answered me in the day of my distress and who has been with me wherever I have gone. Jacob learned it, Jacob knew it, and Jacob understood God, and he knew God. Because God continued to go back to Jacob. Let me tell you something. God will continue to come after you until you come back to Him or go to Him or whatever. God is going to continue to do it. God will do this. We see how God continually do this. But one thing I just, before we leave, I want to make one thing clear that we're going to have to understand through all of this. Notice there was a lot of sin going on here, today's stuff. Deceit, lying, okay, rape, murder. Did you notice that God never corrected anybody at this point? This is a big issue right here. Yes, because they didn't have the law. If you read my paper on the first paper on that goes into all this. The key is God is not going to correct them right now. It's not time yet. Because remember we talked about the first day, God had not given them the law, did not give him the rules and what God expects. So God really, in a sense, didn't hold it against them per se, other than there's no way they're not going to heaven because of their sin. But once the law, this is why we're coming up to the point in a few weeks when we go over the law, once the law is introduced, now sin is revealed. You will, trust me, in this class, you will understand Romans better than ever before. Romans talks so much about the law. The law was given because of this kind of stuff. Because to these guys, they just went ahead with things. But now we know, and because we also have the Holy Spirit to remind us, when we do things, we need to turn away from it. Okay, so remember, as we're going along in these stories, remember, nothing's being done to these guys because the law is not given. Once we get the law, everything's going to change. And now God will then start holding people accountable. All right, any questions over this stuff today? I think I think we still have a few left, but that'll be for next week. Any questions? No problem. Thanks, guys. Enjoy. See